Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Block Party. Today I'm piecing a super Dresden. It's a big Dresden plate with 16 curved petals. So let's get started learning how to create the petals and piece this step by step together. To create our Dresden plate, you're first going to need to cut out your pieces, and you're going to need the cutting template for block 8, and you can find that on page 6 of your pattern. And I took my template, doubled it with freezer paper, and then cut out my shapes. As an alternative, you could also just pick up the Dresden plate template set and use template number 6 from that set to cut out all of your pieces. So once you get your petals cut, and you're going to need a total of 16, 8 of each color, then you're going to create your turning template. That's the other template on the page. That's this one right here. So you're going to create a turning template by, again, print this out onto freezer paper and then put another freezer paper piece on top, press it, and that creates a nice sturdy template that's going to really be easy to turn against. So I'm going to place this, and I'm aligning the edges of this turning template with the bottom edges of that Dresden plate petal. And I'm going to press this in place because it's made out of freezer paper. I'm pressing this waxy side down. That's going to heat up that freezer paper slightly, and it's going to stick lightly to that fabric. So now it's time to turn this bottom edge. So spray just a little bit of spray starch into this cap, and I'm going to paint it with a paintbrush right along the edge of that curve. And I just want to use a little bit at a time, not a lot. You don't want the paper template to get too wet, otherwise it's going to lose its shape and you won't be able to turn this really nicely. Now this was a tip from my dad. He started using these little tweezers, and you can usually find these in the embroidery section of your local quilt shop, and they just grip the fabric and allow you to hold it in place while you press. Now I can do this with my fingers too. Dad's fingers are a whole lot bigger than mine, but it does get really hot here this close to the tip of the iron. So really the tweezers are a good way to go about it. And what I'm doing here is I'm kind of tugging over on the fabric, hitting it with the iron, and that dries the starch and creates a nice firm crease. And you can see this is a really kind of tight curve. So I kind of take my time on this, and I think I dried this little part out a little too quickly. So I'm going to grab my starch and just paint on a little bit more on that corner. It's just wanting to wing up on me. And now I can pull it, get it tight to that turning template, hit it with the tip of the iron again. And what I'm going to do is, as I work down that curve, I'm just creating intentional pleats, just like that. I rotate it around ever so slightly so that way I can get this other side. Again, just a little bit of starch, paint it right on the fabric, right on the edge of that template. And you know, if things get too moist, if things get too wet and your template starts losing its shape, just make another one. It's not a big deal. Print out another page 6 on freezer paper and double it with more freezer paper. That really works the best. Now it's hopping around on me a little bit. Sometimes it's nice if I weigh it down with something and put my scissors on the end here so that way it doesn't move. And so I'm just grabbing that fabric with my tweezers, pulling it tight to the edge of that template, and then with the tip of the iron, I'm just drawing that out. So you can see it's kind of messy through here, but that's okay. I'm going to do kind of a steamroll effect. I'm just going to take the iron and just smoosh it right over the tip of that Dresden plate, and that works great. All right, so that's what you're looking for. That's exactly what you're going for here. Now I'm going to trim it up, and I'm just going to trim this raw edge down to about a quarter of an inch. It's a half of an inch right now. I'm just trim this up to about a quarter of an inch, and then just gently peel it away, and that freezer paper will release really easily, and there is your finished petal. So I usually set it back down onto the pressing board, give it one last press. So that's how you're going to turn all of the edges for this Dresden plate. Just take your time, go on ahead and turn 8 of your fabric B, and then for me is this blue, and 8 of your fabric A, and that's this purple, and make all of those. I'll meet you back here when we're ready to start sewing these together. We're going to piece this Dresden plate together in sets of 2 petals and then piece those together, and that will create 1/4 of our Dresden plate shape. So arrange it like this with 2 fabric B petals in the middle of 2 fabric A petals. We're going to flip over the one on the bottom. We're going to take these to the machine and stitch from that turned edge down to the end. So I'm just taking a second to make sure these edges are in nice alignment, and then I'm using my knee lifter on my machine to lift that presser foot so I can get started stitching. And I like to take about 3 or 4 stitches onto those pieces right at that curve and then backstitch. And that just locks them together so they're not going to come unraveled or come unpicked right at that edge. So as I'm sewing, I'm just making sure that those edges stay in nice alignment all the way down, and then I grab the next set of pieces. Now, for all of the other Dresden plates we've worked on so far, we always made sure that we had the same colors stacked up on top of each other in the same order. This one's different. We're going to do one with blue on top and the next one with purple on top. So that's the way it's going to go. That's correct. It's one of those things I realized whenever I created the design for this one that changing it up can sometimes, throw you off a little bit. So be careful about that. Make sure to return your petals to your layout if you get confused. The next step is to finger press those seams open and then hit them with a nice hot dry iron. And be careful not to catch your folded edge like I just did and open it back up again with your iron. Just be careful about that. And now arrange your petals again into that same arrangement that you had before, where the blue is in the middle. Flip this over and you're going to stitch this seam just the exact same way. Once you have 1/4 of your Dresden plate pieced together, the next step is to square it up. So I'm going to place my ruler over the Dresden plate and I'm lining up the 45-degree line with that center seam line between the 2 fabric B pieces. And I'm just taking a look at this edge, and there's just a little bit of fabric peeking out from that edge. So I'm going to trim it up and press firmly and see if I can just rotate my cutter around, my ruler around, and I can trim up that side too. So you can see all I had to do was trim up a little bit of fuzz, but that guaranteed that these edges are nice and square and 90 degrees, so I can piece 4 of these together and it'll be really accurate. So I've already trimmed these down, they're ready to go, and here's what our block is going to look like. Really, really cute. So the next step is to piece these halves together and then piece the 2 halves together through the middle. I'll show you how to do that next. So I'm here at the machine and I'm just lining up 1/2 of the Dresden plate right on top of the other. Use my knee lifter again, lift that presser foot and slip those pieces underneath. Give a little back stitch and stitch on down. And every once in a while I'll kind of flip up the fabrics and just make sure that they are stacked right on top of one another. It's really nice to be able to just pedal to the middle and stitch them together, but it really only works if they're nicely stacked together and they're going to go together just right. So I'm just clipping off my scrap. That just keeps my bobbin thread organized, wasteless thread, and it also stops the machine from gumming up, and it's one of those things, every time you break thread, it can always gum up the machine. Now, this is one of those situations that can happen. I was in a little bit of a hurry as I made these plates and put them together, a little sloppy, and you can see my center curve is not coming out just exactly right. But here's the thing that I know works well, and that is I cut these square, and so these outer edges, if the outer edges go together, the center is going to get covered up by that center circle, so it doesn't matter what's going on down here. So I'm just focusing on these outer edges where the petals come together. That's where I'm focusing on keeping everything lined up. And, I think it's good for you to see. I make mistakes too, and these petals were put together just a little bit too quickly, I think. It's a normal thing. Gotta slow down and take your time. Make sure every seam is just right. Everything's lining up just right. So let's take a look at our Dresden plate and see if it's gonna be okay. So here is the finished Dresden plate, and I'm just giving it a quick press to press those seam allowances open, and let's take a look and see if it's going to be okay. So the thing you want to look for, if yours ends up a little bit like mine and the center's a little sloppy, what you're looking for is that the plate generally lays down flat. You know, if you have a lump or bump, you know, maybe it's kind of more like that. This is exaggerated, but if it's kind of like that and you can't seem to get that big wrinkle out, then that's a sign that something's out of square. But because we trimmed this up and all of the petals came together square, I think this is going to be okay. Another thing to keep in mind, we're putting a really big center circle on top of this so that even if stuff isn't, you know, kind of lining up and looking nice right here, that's okay. That's going to get completely covered up. So now let's line this up and get it appliqued onto our block background. Now you can find instructions on piecing your block background within the quilt pattern, and I've taken it and just folded it in half and pressed to create a crease line, both horizontal and vertical across it, so that way I can place my block on top. So I am just lining up the seam lines within those, between those fabric A petals, and I'm lining those up with those crease lines that I've created. And this looks pretty good. And what I'm going to do is start gluing this down. Now you can absolutely pen this if you prefer pens, but I really like glue. And this is Elmer's glue that I put into a small glue bottle with a fine tip. I'm going to zoom in so you can really see what I'm doing. So I'm just going to take this glue and I'm going to begin and go around probably 2 petals at a time. I just want a really, really fine line of glue. I don't want a lot. Another alternative type of glue you could use is Roxanne's Glue Basic. You can find that at most quilt shops, and that has a real fine glue tip too. So I get it glued nicely, make sure that this is lined up, those seam lines are lined up with those crease lines, press it in place, and then grab your iron and press with a hot, dry iron. Now you might want to grab a pressing cloth of some sort like this, and that's just going to protect your block, especially those curves in the Dresden plate, from getting a little shiny on the edges, and that just comes from getting a little scorched, a little heated up too much from your iron. So now I'm going to flip up this side of the petals. Again, just a thin line of glue all the way around, not too much. If you used Elmer's glue in the regular glue bottle, it would be way too much glue on your quilt and it would become quite stiff and challenging to stitch through. So you only want to use a little bit. So I'm going to work my way all the way around that flower, just gluing down all the petals and then using my iron to heat set it. So the heat setting, that dries it completely. It's not going anywhere. So I have already created my center circle applique and turned the edges under, and you can find another video on how to do this. So I am just folding this in half gently. If you want to, you can give it a quick press. Just a real quick little crease line there, and that's going to help you line it up. Then I'm going to fold it in half this way, and I'm just aligning that crease line from one side to the other, and that means I'll get a nice horizontal and vertical line running right through the circle. And then I can just line this up right with the petals of the Dresden plate. So here's how this is going to look. Just going to center it up here. Make sure it's evenly spaced. That's the most important thing. You know, we don't want to, although it would be kind of cool to have a lopsided Dresden plate. I'm not aiming for a lopsided plate. I really want it to be nice and symmetrical and placed in the center. So I'm going to glue this down just like this and the rest of my Dresden plate and meet you back here whenever we're ready to applique it down. So I want to stitch down the edge of these appliques, and I'm doing this by machine, and I have installed an edge stitching foot on my machine. And basically this has a blade down the middle, and I've moved my needle over slightly so that way I'm going to stitch an exact, you know, a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch from that folded edge. Now, you don't have to have an edge stitching foot in order to do this. I'm having a little bit of trouble pulling my threads through here, but you don't have to have an edge stitching foot to do this. You can also do this with an applique foot, a zigzag foot, your piecing foot could probably also work. Any of those different feet will work for this stitching. I just wanted to give my edge stitching foot a try just to see how accurate it was. So when using this particular foot, I'm just lining up that center blade right with the folded edge of the applique. And then I'm stitching slowly and carefully as I use my hands to pivot the block. So it's just a few stitches, and then as I'm stitching, I'm just kind of steadily turning the block. And that's going to produce a nice smooth edge, a nice smooth stitching. If I do a lot of jerky movements or push the block and turn it too fast, then I could end up with some jagged stitching. Now I set so my needle will always end in the down position. That's really helpful. That means that if I have to stop and reposition my hands and pivot, then it's not going to shift away from my foot, and I'm not going to have a big ugly stitch on my quilt. So I'm just slowly and carefully stitching around the center circle. And this is one of those things that you have a lot of options for. Just like you have a lot of different feet that you could use for this, you also have more options when it comes to this top stitching. You could do a decorative stitch around the center circle. You could also hand applique the center circle down and the petals down. I have another video on hand applique if you'd like to watch it. It just covers all of those basics and kind of gets you started doing this by hand instead. Now you might be wondering about those thread tails where you started. I just grab a cheater needle. This is a self-threading needle that has a little groove at the top of the needle. I run that to the back of the block. I'm just running it straight through to the back of the block. And then I'm going to take those thread tails and pop them into the eye of the needle. I'm trying to move my hand so that way you can see what I'm doing, but basically I'm just popping those thread tails into the eye of the needle, and then I carry them, pull them straight through to the back. So really quick and easy. All I'm going to do is just tie those in a knot on the back, and that'll be perfectly secure. So now as I stitch up to it, those thread tails are not in my way. They're not going to get caught around my foot. They're not going to cause any problems. So now I'm stitching around my petal shapes. I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm stitching about 1/8 of an inch from that folded outer edge. And you'll notice that I have changed feet. I have switched to my patchwork foot. This is just my normal piecing foot that I use for quilting. And the reason I do that is when I'm coming into areas like this, where the blade of that edge stitching foot would be on the background and it's going to bump up against the petals, a lot of times I find that that throws my stitchings off, and it just kind of gums up the works a little bit, makes it a little challenging. So I find that when I'm stitching a circle or any kind of outer shape where I'm not going to have to overlap that foot over my fabrics, then that works great. But anytime that I'm stitching around something like this, I'm usually going to want to switch to an applique foot or a patchwork foot and work my way around just like this. So that's just a personal thing, and it's come from a lot of experience of just doing a lot of applique and playing around with it and figuring out what works best. That doesn't mean that all edge stitching feet are the same. So play around with it and definitely see what works best for you and your machine. Now you'll notice that I'm pivoting in a pretty big way here. As I come down to that point, I stop right on that seam line, right where those petals come together, and then I rotate the whole block around just like this to change direction and bring my stitching up to continue running parallel with those petal shapes. And now if I was doing a decorative stitch, this would be a little tricky because you would want your decorative stitch to kind of come in and dead end right on that point, right where those petals come together. That's why I haven't done a lot of decorative stitching over these Dresden plates, simply because I know that that won't always work out just exactly right. And that's one of those things that drives me crazy. So I like the look of a straight stitch right along the edge, a blanket stitch, and a zigzag. All of those look really good. And it's not going to matter if a piece of it gets kind of cut off or something like that. Those types of stitches look really good along the edge of your appliques. And here's what it looks like whenever you finish your block number 8 Dresden plate. So that's it for this video. If you're looking for the quilt pattern and the templates to help you put this block together, you can find it at leahday.com/blockparty. This is the 8th block in this series, and for each block we learn not only how to piece it together, we also learn how to quilt it too. So make sure to join me for the video next week as we learn how to quilt this with many beautiful designs. If you liked this video, please share it with your friends and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. That really helps me out a lot. And of course, ask any questions you have about quilting. I really want to help you learn more about this and make beautiful quilts. Until next time, let's go quilt.